Thank you so much.
Yes, okay, so I'm just gonna speak loudly. We are talking about today about exploring the formation and maintenance of delusions, and mostly we will focus on apophenia. So I imagine most of the things will be new for you, but I think that your questions earlier sort of covered a lot of things I'm going to talk about. So I'm very happy I can kind of skip through a lot of the points.
Speak with the browser.
Sorry, that's my fault.
Okay.
No.
It was working earlier, so yeah.
Oh, is it here?
No.
I'll click through. Wait, sorry. Oh,
Okay, it's a bit slow. Maybe it's the battery, yeah. Okay, so can you maybe? No, I can
or
actually.
just tell me when you can.
I think again.
Yeah, you can.
Oh, yeah. Okay, perfect.
Okay, so I want to talk about sort of three main things. First, of course, to define psychotic phenomena with the special focus on delusions. I'm going to kind of rush through some of the main models of delusions that examine or offer a framework to understand the formation and maintenance of delusions. And then I'm going to propose apophenia as a mechanism for maintaining and forming delusions that comes actually from the third type of models, the continuum models. So yeah, what are psychotic phenomena? When we talk about psychotic phenomena, we usually mean a group of symptoms that lie on the schizophrenia spectrum. And those symptoms can be broadly divided into three categories in respect to the domain of abnormalities they manifest. So we have positive symptoms, negative and disorganized symptoms. Positive symptoms are usually disorders or abnormalities of thought and perception. And paradigmatic examples are delusions and hallucinations, while negative and disorganized symptomatology include abnormalities within affect and behavior, and also disorganized symptomatology has some disorganizations within cognition. But I'm going to skip through this, and we're going to focus mostly on positive symptomatology. So within positive symptomatology, as prime examples, we have delusions and hallucinations. And delusions are considered the most important markers of schizophrenia, alongside, of course, hallucinations. And I'm very glad that the previous talk sort of covered the definition of delusions and some of the problems of that definition. But we have three main aspects of the definition of delusions. So they are fixed and false beliefs that are not sort of accessible to change, or they are very hard to change in the face of contrary evidence, and they are formed despite the lack of any evidence to sort of conform to those beliefs. The second important aspect of the definition is that regards the content of delusions, and they are mostly bizarre or impossible beliefs, or they are highly improbable beliefs. So they can be possible, but they are highly improbable because they are formed in the face or despite the lack of any evidence to support them. And within the realm of bizarre beliefs, I gave some examples like thought insertion, thought withdrawal, delusions of control. For example, thought insertion is a belief that usually some outside force, but it can also be an individual, is inserting our thoughts into our head, so that our thoughts are not our own. And non-bizarre beliefs, like I said, they are not impossible, but they are highly, highly improbable. And for example, persecutory beliefs are beliefs that some individual or usually an organization is following us and observing us with the aim of harming us in some way. And the third aspect of the definition is that they are beliefs outside of the current scientific and social and cultural norms and consensus, so belief systems. So there are a lot of problems with this definition, but in order to sort of move on, I just want for us to accept it and go to the models of delusions. So we have three main models, and I'm going to talk about them in regards of some of their most important aspects and their similarities of how they view and understand delusion formation and maintenance. So the first belief positive models are called positive models because they actually consider the normal functioning of the brain and other cognitive functions, and view delusions as sort of a breakdown of that kind of functioning. And types of delusions they mostly deal with are something we call monopathic delusions. So delusions that form because of some identifiable and clear medical condition that mostly includes mechanical brain impairments and other impairments of neural networks and structures. So we're not going to talk about these kind of delusions mostly, but what it's similar to belief negative models I'm going to talk about is that once they identify the structure that is impaired, they actually deal with other factors that maintain delusions, and they deal with mostly the same maintenance factors of delusions as belief negative models. Yeah, so we're going to talk about these factors here. Belief negative models come from cognitive psychology, and differently to previous models, they consider idiopathic delusions. So those are delusions that are formed and maintained in the absence of any clear brain impairment or dysfunction of, for example, neural networks. And we can consider those delusions, or at least I do, as true cases of delusions, because otherwise, if they were formed due to any medical condition, they would have a specific classification within diagnostic classification systems, but other delusions are usually within psychotic disorders and so on. So belief negative models, because they come from cognitive psychology, they actually focus on different cognitive processes or our reasoning processes. The mouse is with me.
Oh,
so
sorry.
I'm doing that. Sorry, I will try not to.
Thank you.
They focus on cognitive or probabilistic reasoning processes as something that is aiding the formation and maintenance of delusions. They are very, I mean, mostly they are very empirically based, but the most, I would say the model that has the most empirical basis is this Gerty and Freeman's model of persecutory delusions. I will talk about this model because it identifies some of the cognitive biases that are actually included into the formation and maintenance of delusions. But it's not, even though it's proposed as a model of delusions of persecution, it's not really specific to it, because it was based on the broader empirical basis of research that deals with other subtypes of delusions, and it doesn't have anything within the model that is specific to persecution. So it can be generalized to other delusions as well. So delusions are viewed, and this is similar to belief positive models as well. Delusions are viewed as something that forms on the basis of abnormal or ambiguous experiences. And then we try to explain such perceptual experiences. And within that process of explanation, of giving some meaning and narrative to what we saw, what we experienced, we make, or some people make correct inferences. And based on those inferences, we draw delusional conclusions. And now we have other formation factors that will further aid in persistence of such delusions, and they become delusional beliefs. Both of these formation and maintenance factors are actually kind of the same probabilistic processes of reasoning these models consider. So this second part of giving meaning or narrative to these perceptions is actually similar in both models. So Gertian-Freeman model actually identifies two biases, two cognitive biases that are really intimately related to delusions. First one is jumping to conclusion bias, and the second one is biased against disconfirmatory evidence. So GTC bias is a tendency to use fewer than optimal data in order to make a decision about something. Or so if we think about internal events or our mental representations, we form some hypotheses about our world, and then we use less than optimal data to confirm that hypothesis and draw some decision. And it was noticed in plethora of studies that JTC bias is present in people with delusions, while other control groups, mostly general population and groups that are diagnosed with some kind of disorders but without delusions, usually we use a group with depressive disorders, do not exhibit the same bias. So just to illustrate how we measure jumping to conclusion bias, the standard task is called the beads task. So participants are told we have two jars of beads. In both of the jars, we have blue and red beads, or any other two colors. But in one jar, one color of beads is predominantly present, and the other in the other beads. In the other jar, it's vice versa. Usually we use the proportion of 85 to 15 of blue and red beads, and vice versa. So participants then do not see jars, but they, on the computer screen, they see drawings of beans one by one. And they have to, they can control how many draws they want to see. And then their task is to make a decision from which jar beads are pulled out. And what was noticed that in most cases, people diagnosed with some psychosis disorders with delusions actually use very little opportunities to draw beads from jars and make their decisions very, very fast, while other control groups do not generally do that. And even after two draws of beans, they make a decision about the jar. And also another empirical results that go that confirm this the idea that GTC task is, or this bias is connected to delusions, is that even people that are in remission from delusions exhibit JTC bias. but they exhibited differentially to people with active delusions and to other control groups. So they have diminished JTC compared to people with active delusions, and but they still have increased bias compared to other control groups without delusions. And the other bias that was identified as important for delusions is ADE. So bias against this confirmatory evidence. And this is a tendency to neglect evidence that goes against our hypothesis that we formed about the external world. So in the standard BEADS task I just described, we would further examine this bias when our participants make a decision about the jar, and then we further give them opportunity to see another draw of beads, and then again ask them if they want to change their hypothesis now, their decision about the jar, and this goes on for some time. So it was noticed that people with delusions actually do not change their hypothesis. They stay on the initial decision they made, while other control groups usually do change their hypothesis. We here have the results about this bias are not that robust. Previous JTC bias is actually more robustly shown. Kind of these results are continuously shown to happen in populations with delusions and without delusions, but ADE has some inconsistency. We can talk about that in the discussion part. But these two biases are identified as specific data gathering processes that are present when in people with delusions, when they make inferences about the world. And what is specific about belief negative models is they actually propose cognitions or processes specific to delusions. So that implies that they should be present in people with delusions, but absent in people without delusions. But another big field of research within cognitive psychology actually pretty robustly shows that we all use both processes that are accessible to us. So those are mainly groups of processes, type 1 processes that are more automatic heuristic processes, and they are based on our experience about the world. So when we are in a situation when we have to make a decision about something, we decide quickly based on our previous experience, and those processes are pretty optimal, and most of the time they work, and sometimes they actually lead to errors, and we call those errors cognitive biases. Another group of processes are called type 2 processes because they are slow, they are more analytical, and they conform to this kind of normative or probabilistic paths of reasoning, and they lead to correct answers that are in line with theory of probability. So both of these processes, of course, are features of human cognition, and they are universally present. We all use them pretty often. So my problem with these models is precisely the fact that they postulate a specific to delusions cognition. It is more likely the case that there is a greater tendency for people with delusions to rely more robustly and more often on maybe type 1 processes. So we can talk about cognitive styles of reasoning more plausibly than we should talk about specific cognitions only present in delusions. And a lot of empirical research actually shows this is the case. So actually the story of cognitive styles, or the greater tendency to rely more often on some processes rather than others, leads us to continuum models of delusions, and they are trait-based models. So continuum models, they come from psychology of individual differences, and because of that field, they usually consider predictors and correlates, or so other traits that are associated with delusional beliefs. And they are not necessarily opposed to previous two models, but there are some key differences, although they can be integrated if, for example, belief negative models would be kind of stretched a bit. So two important features of continuum models is that they first propose traits or dispositions that we can observe. We can observe individual differences in people regarding these dispositions that contribute to the formation and that of delusions and further maintain them. And the other important aspects of these models is that they understand delusions as continuums or as dispositions themselves. And this is also pretty empirically based. But this kind of differs from previous two models because even though it's not explicitly there, they still imply some sort of a categorical view of delusions. We either have them, they exist, or they do not. However, continuum models talk about something that it's called schizophrenia continuum or a psychosis continuum, and sort of put different delusional experience on this dimension of psychosis continuum. And this view of psychosis is actually not that new. It began in 20th century, but now it's more pronounced and dominant because I think because empirical basis is now large enough to for us to now shift our models to continuum views. And we have, actually, I wanted to mention three main pieces of evidence that speak strongly for continuum models of psychosis phenomena. First, it is noticed and very often that delusions and other psychosis experiences, so those positive and negative and disorganized symptoms we mentioned, are present in general population as well. They are not unique to groups of people that have diagnosis of some psychotic disorder. The second one is that delusions in people with diagnosis of some psychotic disorder are not strong and fixed equally. So we have degrees even in the population with something we would call clinical, maybe manifestations of delusions. We still have degrees of strength, of fixedness and conviction in regards to delusion, both with the same person throughout a period of time and between people that are diagnosed with some psychotic disorder. And these two things together actually imply that we can recognize some intermediate states of delusional experiences, and we usually call them psychotic-like, delusion-like beliefs and experiences, hallucination-like experiences that are present throughout the population, and we have individual differences with respect to these experiences. So we have some populational variation here. And the third aspect is that even experienced, I noticed some mistakes, sorry, even experienced clinicians, when they are tasked to categorizing delusions of people who do have a diagnosed psychotic disorders into two groups, definitely present or definitely absent, they also have problems with categorizing their experiences, and half of the time they actually put question marks. So they denote a relative or questionable presence of delusions. And this all, I think, is a very strong basis for us to talk about something that is called the psychosis continuum. So within continuum models, we actually understand psychosis phenomena as a dimension, as a disposition. We all differ between each other, or rather we all stand somewhere on this dimension of individual differences, and it is a very large part or important part of individual differences within a population. We can talk about that later. I'm just going to skip it now. But this continuum view actually sees psychosis as a dimension. And on extreme poles of this dimension, we have extreme presence, or something that would be a severe psychosis, mostly present in groups that have some diagnosed psychotic disorder. And on the other pole of dimension, we have a complete absence of delusional experiences. But between those two poles, we have a dimension with the plethora of intermediate states of psychosis-like experiences that are mostly present in general population. So the unique feature of these models is that they actually see something that we would call clinical delusions, and something that we would notice as psychosis-like phenomena in as subclinical manifestations of such phenomena. They view both of those things as qualitatively the same. The only difference is quantitative. Some are severe and constantly present, and other more delusion-like experiences are more accessible to change. They are less fixed, their strength is decreased, and so on. And I want to now propose apophenia as one of the trait mechanisms that comes from these continuum models, and that which is actually one of the key factors in forming and maintaining delusions. So apophenia, that is a tendency to perceive meaning where there is none, sort of simplistically said, but to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated events, and to see meaningful patterns or objects in ambiguous environment. And we can find apophenia in every sensory modality. And we can also talk about apophenia within beliefs, which is a more interesting case of apophenia for me. I call it temporal apophenia because it supposes it proposes erroneous causal connection or association between some events in our environment or inner mental representations and other events in environment, and making wrong inferences, usually causal inferences between those events. So the example I always give is when we think about some person we haven't seen or thought about in a long time, and then on the same day we actually stumble upon that same person. So we can consider these two things as two events. One is an inner state or a mental representation event, and the other is event of the sort of external world. But the association of these events is coincidental, and we make causal inferences about that association and think this is something meaningful, something that has a greater personal significance, and so on. And because apophenia includes different instances of seeing or finding meaning and patterns in places where they're actually absent, we usually say that it is a disposition toward false positives or type 1 errors. So finding significance where there is none. That's a type 1 error, while type 2 errors are actually missing real true patterns when they are present in an environment and decoding them as absent. That's a type 2 error. We'll come back to that. And there are many instances of apophenia that are labeled differently in respect to the content of a type 1 error, but we call them apophenia as an umbrella term. And now I want to talk about three things. So why is apophenia a more fundamental tendency than tendency to experience psychosis and psychosis-like phenomena that continuum models propose psychosis are? And the second one is to sort of provide some of the empirical basis that shows apophenia is most intimately related to psychosis-like phenomena and especially delusions, besides, of course, the strongest relationship those psychotic phenomena have amongst themselves. And the third is to talk about some similarities in respect to the basis of these two biases I mentioned that look a lot like actually apophenia. So the first thing, why is apophenia?
Have about 20 minutes left, which includes your question.
Oh.
So you decide.
Okay, I will go.
You decide how much time. you
Yes.
give the Q&A
Okay,
process.
maybe, yeah, okay, sorry.
Just your no, it's just your choice.
Yeah, okay, so why is apophenia fundamental disposition? Within psychology of perception, it is noticed that type 1 errors in perception are actually very common throughout the general population. So they must have some evolutionary advantage or benefit for us to have such individual differences and variation in population regarding these type of errors. And this benefit comes from pattern perception itself. It is very, of course, beneficial for us to perceive patterns in our environment because that allows us to control that environment and to avoid dangerous stimuli like predators and to find food and, prolong our existence. And because pattern perception is such an important cognitive feature for us, our organism, or rather cognitive perceptual apparatus, is in a state of constant readiness to find patterns in the environment. And because it is in this hypersensitive state towards information and patterns, our activation thresholds for stimuli are lowered. So this lowering of activation threshold has more evolutionary advantage because it raises the probability of noticing all important stimuli in our environment, but consequently also raises the probability of making type 1 errors because we will then decode more of other sort of ambiguous patterns as important and meaningful, even they are not. And this is more beneficial to the other scenario of having a heightened or more conservative activation threshold, which would decrease type 1 errors. So we wouldn't have this wrongful perception of meaning. We would have more only correct perceptions of real patterns, but we would also have more misses of real patterns in the environment, which we would encode as something that is absent. So those are type 2 errors. So we favor our cognitive system or the proposed device that's doing this hyperactive agency detection device favors type 1 errors as opposed to type 2 errors, or rather this lowered activation threshold. And apophenia is a consequence of such a trait that is very beneficial for our survival and is seen as a dimension on which we can measure individual differences, and there is variation in people regarding how prone they are to making apophenic type 1 errors. And the second important part about apophenia is that it is today, most importantly, connected to psychosis, to phenomena on the psychosis continuum, both in subclinical and in clinical manifestations of psychosis. Within subclinical, we here have different instances of apophenia that are positively connected with different instances of psychosis phenomena, or rather psychosis-like phenomena. So delusional ideation, paranormal beliefs, proneness to hallucination, schizotypy, which is actually a model of schizophrenia spectrum that we regard as a trait, as a disposition to experience both positive, negative, and disorganized symptoms. Within clinical symptomatology of psychosis phenomena, apophenia is also connected to delusions and hallucinations in clinical groups or groups of people that are diagnosed with some psychosis disorders. And as a third part, I sort of highlighted, although it is also subclinical, apophenia is also linked with such traits that are proposed to as models of psychosis continuum, like disintegration and schizotypia we mentioned, that encapsulate all three symptoms of psychosis phenomena. And at the end, I wanted to actually talk about these biases that are highlighted as key factors for formation and maintenance of delusions, jumping to conclusion bias and bias against opposing evidence. So authors that research these biases in relation to delusions usually will postulate mechanisms that should be underlying to those biases, or that should explain how those wrong inferences are made. And they call them aberrant salience or hypersalience of evidence hypothesis matches, which actually represent wrongly associating internal mental events or mental representations with external events, which sounds like apophenia the way I described it earlier. But because those two fields of psychology, individual differences and cognitive psychology, rarely communicate, they are not mentioned as something that is analogous or a synonym. And I want to actually propose that apophenia is this mechanism that underlies these kind of biases that are made based on wrong association between wrong associations between events. And to sum it all up, even though we lack empirical research on the connection between apophenia and these biases, I assume that it will be significantly connected with them. And as the second, that apophenia should be taken as one of the key dispositions that underlies psychosis phenomena and delusions. That's it.
Marija, thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes. I'm going to try to get to some folks who didn't have a chance to talk last time. So.
Hi, my name is
Hi.
Susanna Chappell. So I firstly is that I want to start with something positive in that I think before I say anything negative. You know,
So I will brace myself.
no. But no, what I want to say is I think I really like your point about apophenia, and I think there's a really good paper in there. But my problem is with much of the stuff you were describing before, which is not really your point, but you know what you were kind of grounding it on. Well, first of all, it's the usual problem from my perspective, which is it's very much based on schizophrenia. And it's very much based on schizophrenia.
Okay.
And a lot of us, including me, we live with affective psychoses or have had experiences of affective psychoses. So it's do not have the hallucinations and the delusions that way. But, you know, other things can be psychotic as well, like emotions, which is often left out. So firstly, you could like just say qualify, you know, in your definition, you say the definition has problems, but it's not important. But it is important for the people in the room, like me. You know, are you talking about me or are you talking? Well, it's important for research because we want to make sure that this enormously large group of people is not left out. And then this links to the continuum model as well. Because for me, I think delusions, I guess we have different positions on this. So delusions and hallucinations are different from psychosis. I mean, partly also because a lot of us have experiences of psychosis without delusions and hallucinations. And many people I know and have talked to have experiences of delusions and hallucinations without what you would recognize as psychosis. So then what do we do? Like, you say psychotic-like experiences, but they're not really psychotic-like experiences. They are hallucinations. People occasionally have them, like people like Oliver Sacks have written this, for example. So I think it's important to have this because first of all, I don't think you need to limit yourself to the schizophrenia type experiences in order to make apophenia work in your paper. So you're just like limiting yourself. Secondly, it's important for inclusion. It's important for research. We want to make progress. So yeah, these are my main points, and I can add more things if you're interested.
Yeah. So those are very good points. And I actually kind of rushed through that part. But when I say psychosis phenomena or psychosis experiences, I mostly meant positive symptomatology of schizophrenia spectrum. I said at the beginning of the presentation that there are 3 groups of symptoms or phenomena that are present within the whole spectrum of schizophrenia. And positive symptoms deal with those with hallucinations and delusions, but negative and disorganized symptoms deal with other manifestations that are more regarding affect. So depressive affect, anhedonia, avolition, and disorganized parts of symptomatology. But I mostly based the whole presentation on positive symptomatology. But there are, like you said, I don't have to limit apophenia to only one group of symptomatology. The last part, the last study I showed about the connection between apophenia and disintegration. Disintegration is a trait that actually encompasses all phenomena on psychosis continuum, and apophenia is positively connected to that trait. And also schizotypia, when I mentioned that, most models of schizotypia will encompass all of the symptoms. So not only delusions or delusional-like experiences, but other affective symptoms. So yeah. You're right. There is a substantial place for other symptoms, but I think the predominant evidence I have currently is something that is based on positive symptomatology.
Okay, hold on. We have a couple more questions we're going to have to get to. Yes.
Hi,
Hi.
thank
I
you.
see you.
Thank you for this. I have a question about the real patterns. So you described apophenia as something like pattern detection where there are none. And my mind went to several places on what do you mean by real patterns and when there are none? And to make that concrete, the beads test, how would you respond to the charge of, say, Matt Parrott and people that those who are jumping to conclusions after, say, 2 beads from the 85 bead pot are being hyper rational, right? They're doing impeccable Bayesian reasoning. And when they do the incentivized test, when they're offered money to get it right, they actually slow down because they're detecting more patterns in what's going on, namely about the social context. So that's a kind of concrete way of saying what's going on in these cases isn't a failure of rationality, but a hyper rationality and an insensitivity to patterns in the social context. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I didn't understand well. Are you citing a study that calls this hyperrationality and shows that they actually make correct decisions based on fewer data, or is it a hypothetical case that this can be hyper-rationality?
I mean, just in pure Bayesian terms,
Okay.
if you've got a 0.85 and it comes out twice, right, you're up to 0.995 credence function, right? So the point that Matt Parrott and Carolus and people are making is that this is a terrible model for human reasoning.
Okay, so I'm not sure. I think so. The number of beads based on which we detect bias that they needed to make a decision is always compared to probabilistic inferences. What is the optimal number you need to see for a certain proportion in the task? And then if they want to see a number of beads below that optimal number, that is a bias. We say it's biased decision. It doesn't have to mean it would be a wrong decision, because those biases that are consequences of our heuristic reasoning are actually doing quite well in most of environments and our and situations where we need to make a quick decision. So they are usually sort of a rule of thumbs that make correct decisions in most of the cases. And this is where we don't see those heuristics, but we notice them precisely in those moments when we make mistakes and we detect them as some kind of biases. But if you wanted to say that these processes are good, I agree. The models of cognitive functioning of humans say that too. Those are called heuristic models of, for example, Kahneman and Tversky, if you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question is like, I mean, what are the limitations and the criticism for these kind of modeling approaches trying to, I mean, explain the psychiatric disorders, especially like schizophrenia and apophenia? For an example, if you just consider symptoms like or conditions like thought insertion, thought broadcasting, those will be tricky to understand, and also the neurobiology will be not that clear, right, regarding those kind of conditions, right? So for an example, like a condition like anhedonia, we can have like some kind of reference to impairments in the dopamine system, right, in the reinforcement learning part. Like, but I mean, as a whole, like there are like connectionist modeling, reinforcement learning modeling approaches, Bayesian models, like all these kind of cognitive and computational approaches to, I mean, trying to understand these kind of disorders, right? But I mean, there are like serious challenges, right? Trying to, I mean, understand those kind of some tricky like symptoms, right? So surely there must be some kind of criticisms, right?
Yes, there's a lot of criticism and a lot of problems with these models. But the thing you mentioned, models of reinforcement learning that show that there is some kind of, let's say, less than optimal functioning of reinforcement, and that is also connected to D2 dopamine receptors. Those models are compatible with continuum models, because continuum models need another level of explanations, and they usually will use other biological and neural models to go down to more mechanicistic explanations of what's going on. They're mostly, I would say, descriptive now. What is another main flaw is that they, to this day, have not incorporated a lot of studies or evidence from such studies that will examine causal relationship between apophenia and other phenomena I was talking about. So it's mostly correlational. And we then remain on this level of only description of phenomena. We can go down to the causes. The causal studies that would examine causal relationship would have to manipulate apophenia. So try to increase it or decrease it in experimental groups, and then measure what happens with for example, delusion-like beliefs or irrational beliefs like believing in conspiracy theories, whether those beliefs will then increase or decrease as a consequence of apophenia decreasing or increasing. We still lack a lot of studies like that. So those are some of the main problems, but there are also a lot of epistemological problems in regards to how apophenia is defined, because we propose that there is an objective, true external world, and there are patterns that are real, and then we make mistakes or see them as they are. So we have this view of the world as something that contains true and real patterns. That's one of the problems with the definition of finding meaning, where meaning is absent, because meaning needs to assume an interpretive process of something. So how can we say that's a wrong meaning without proposing, okay, there is a world that has right and wrong meanings, real and false patterns. So this is a problem also, a lot of problems, but I can't, I deal with them in my dissertation. I can't do this now.
Okay, so now that we've gotten to the nature of reality as such, let's just thank Maria for this wonderful talk. And then Harriet is going to tell us about lunch plans.
So there will be lunch. It will be served through here. There we do not have plates today. So if you have a little plate, bring your plate. There will be some coffee, some fruit, other stuff, and we will have basically 1 hour, 45-minute break now. So we'll be back here at 2 p.m. Do whatever you want, check out the chapel, and we'll see you then.
Thanks. Sorry, just in case people want to go outside and get some fresh air, you can go out here. There's sort of a river terrace. There's a little coffee shop there. The food will be here, but if people want to go for some fresh air and better coffee, then effectively, if you move that way. Can we put something on the chairs? That's like
It's pandemic. You're like,
Thank you. So thank you to all of the organizers for putting in such hard work to get this thing going. And for having me out here, I feel very honored. This is very much a work in progress. So if there are things that you would like to suggest or problems that you find, I'm happy to learn from this experience and incorporate them. Okay, so without further ado, now working again. Let's try this. Oh, no worries. Okay. So apologies to those who thought that we were done talking about hearts. So it's intuitive to think that the human heart has the function to pump blood. This is what it does, or what it should do, that contributes to a whole host of system level activities, including distribution of nutrients and waste through the body, certain fluid dynamics of the circulatory system, and so on, that are connected to the continuing survival and reproduction of human beings and vertebrates more generally. If we think of functions as picking out a standard, and thus as normative, at least in a minimal sense, then the normativity we ascribe to the heart's pumping is what I'll be calling biological. Natural selection, contribution to fitness or the propensity to do so, autopoiesis or self-maintenance, or some other biological mechanism that acts on whole systems indirectly and in part through the pumping or lack thereof of that system's heart, or sorry. Yeah, so these biological mechanisms act indirectly on the heart, in part through its pumping, such that that system's heart or the hearts of its progeny is there, in part because it pumps. So I'm going to suggest that biological normativity is concerned with standards of activity relative to past, present, or future continuation of individual biological systems, species, ecosystems, and so on. And I'm going to be suggesting that it's primarily a pragmatic or practical kind of normativity. I don't think it's a standard that in the first instance is concerned with getting things right. I think it's concerned with things like survival and reproduction. Sorry. It's also intuitive that human vision functions to in some way represent distal objects or features of the environment, at least partly veridically or to some degree of accuracy. And human declarative memory functions to retrieve or reconstruct known facts or past experiences. These are descriptions, what I've just said, are descriptions of what vision and remembering are activities for that help us distinguish them as distinct types of activity and as each part of our mental economy. Importantly, even if we don't hold that vision or memory are ways of knowing, that is, if we go sort of non-epistemic, still in giving these functions to vision and memory, we appeal at least implicitly to veridicality or accuracy or truth/truth preservation. So my suggestion will be that the normativity of these functions is primarily rational. Such normativity is not as pragmatic as biological normativity. Rational normativity is concerned primarily with getting things right, or at least coherent and consistent. It can be made practical, pragmatic, strategic, and so on, but none of these are the standard that in the first instance, rational normativity establishes. This is a bit of a long way of an introduction, and the outline for my talk is as follows. So first, I'm going to discuss what I call formal functions, which I think are often the kinds of functions ascribed in cognitive science and philosophy of mind. Then I'm going to talk about biological functions, which unsurprisingly are the sorts of functions that I think are ascribed in biology and philosophy of biology. Then I'm going to be suggesting that there's a gap between these notions of function, and that this gap is problematized by a variety of different phenomena that are often variously treated under the heading of, I guess the most general heading of things like mental illness. So that's the plan. Nope. Okay. So, I think this is not too outdated, but a lot of computational cognitive science is inspired by Marr. So, and in particular, this sort of three-level analysis of cognition. So Marr, in his famous book on vision, distinguishes these three levels: the computational, algorithmic, representational / process, and implementational. And they're defined by different questions that you can be asking in conducting a study on cognition. So the first is, what's the goal of the computation? Why is it appropriate? And what is the logic of the strategy by which it can be carried out? The algorithmic or representational is, what is the representation for the input and output? And what is the algorithm for the transformation which constitutes the computation? And the implementation question is, how can the representation and algorithm be realized physically? So I think that, sorry, having to do both at once is a little bit tricky. So, oh, okay, great. The clicker wasn't working, unfortunately. Yeah, there might be a way, but I can't figure out that mapping currently. So here afterwards, I'm going to be focusing on computational theories of mind and research programs in cognitive science and philosophy of mind that are computational. As I take it that these account for like the majority of philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists working today. And one of my major targets in this talk is just the sort of background metaphysical picture adopted by these philosophers and scientists. I don't think I have any knockdown arguments, and my guess is that I'll do about as much to upset them than anything else. But so I think computational cognitive science ascribes functions at the computational and algorithmic levels primarily. The ascription of functions at this level or these levels picks out an input and output inclusive mapping, or an algorithm that carries out such a mapping. Call such functions formal. So an example of this that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is edge detection. So strictly speaking, the veridicality or accuracy of edge detection is determined in light of what goes on downstream in the visual system and the constrained interactions that we have with the environment. Determining which of the filters that have been proposed is actually used and at what sort of fineness of grain by early visual processing will make reference to how the whole visual system achieves accuracy in its production of visual representations. So really this is a sort of sub-formal function of the overall formal function of the visual system. But the idea here is that even in identifying or trying to identify such sub-formal functions, what cognitive scientists often do is they identify a mapping, right? And the input and output representations of that kind of mapping in identifying the relevant function. So here's the upshot of this. I don't think that formal functions commit the ascriber to the physical structure or dispositions of the function bearing part, except at the limit. So I think this is sometimes captured in the literature by saying that such functions are multiply realizable or medium independent. The former strikes me as more apt in this context, since biological functions can be performed by differently constituted mechanisms as well. There's a question of whether cognition is really multiply realizable, but even if it weren't, it's much more sort of, it's not as dependent on its mechanisms in describing these formal functions than is, say, blood pumping sufficient to facilitate the dynamics of nutrient and waste distribution in an organism. So I believe this sort of difference in degree in how much the functions depend on physical instantiation is sufficient to draw a distinction in kind between the notions of function ascribed in cognitive systems on the one hand and biological systems on the other. What the ascription of a formal function does commit the ascriber to, I think, is a norm that applies to item activity. And I think at least some of these norms are norms of rationality, where norms of rationality have to do with accuracy, verticality, getting things in the world right. And I'm just going to talk about that in terms of truth. You can push me on that in Q&A if you like. But the idea here then is that at least some formal functions tell you that the activity of a function bearing item should track or preserve truth. Okay, so that's formal functions. Biological functions. So I think there are like two very broad camps in the philosophy of biology that is concerned with function. The first I'm calling here systematic. So according to systematic theorists, biological function is an activity that an item actually performs and that contributes to an explanation of some system level capacity or activity that is more complicated or distinct in kind. So I'm getting this directly from Cummins, but you can think of Bors's view of Bors's biostatistical view as sort of falling under the systematic camp. On the other hand, there are what I'm calling evolutionary function, the evolutionary view. And I only use this term because I don't want to conflate the set of views that I have in mind with etiological or selected effects accounts, which I think are one view among many here. But I couldn't find a better label. So if you have any ideas of what I could replace evolutionary with, that'd be great. So according to this view, biological function is an activity that an item is supposed to perform and that contributes to system survival or reproduction or self-maintenance, accounts for past selection of ancestral system, accounts for the propensity of the system to survive and reproduce, and so on. So I'm capturing the sort of evolutionary camp, all of the accounts of biological function that involve normativity, which normativity is supposed to be grounded by some biological process, and which biological process it's grounded by differs depending on the account. So the sort of case that you might be familiar with, oh, sorry, there we go. So we think of the pumping as something that the heart is supposed to do, whereas the whooshing sounds that the pumping produces by pumping as not sort of its normal biological function. And the idea here is that some biological process, be it natural selection or self-maintenance or contribution to the propensity for survival and reproduction and whatever, is selecting, as it were, the activity of pumping and not sort of the activity of making a whooshing sound, which might in some contingent contexts lead to some diagnostics that then saves your life or whatever, right? So this is the sort of accident function distinction that we heard about yesterday. Okay. So these views sort of differ with respect to what they commit the ascriber to. Systematic views are such that if you ascribe a function according to them, a biological function, you are then committed to there being an actual physical structure and dispositions of the function bearing item. that you're picking out as part of your account. While this does not commit you necessarily to there being any norms, right? So a Cummins function could be to make a whooshing noise as part of this larger mechanism for diagnosis, but it may not be. Evolutionary accounts, and this is often touted as an advantage that they have, don't allow you to do that sort of thing. And that's because biological functions ascribed under the evolutionary accounts commit the ascriber to the physical structure and disposition the item is supposed to have. Biological function commits the ascriber to there being some biological norm grounded in biological processes that the item activity is supposed to satisfy, right? So it's supposed to be that the item at least contributed to fitness in the past, or has produced the propensity to contribute to fitness, or is conducive to autopoiesis or self-maintenance and the like. So there is some standard, at the very least, that the activity is supposed to meet. Okay. So the argument that I'm giving today is really fairly simple, and I suspect for that reason, very easy to destroy. So formal functions are neutral on structure and disposition, at least up to the limit, and are not neutral on norms, including what I'm calling norms of rationality. Biological functions are not neutral on structure or disposition, and can be neutral on norms of rationality, and often are. Formal functions and biological functions entail distinct ontological commitments then in their ascription. And so we have two different notions of function. Otherwise, the ascription of the one function would have the entailments that the ascription of the other kind of function would have, and vice versa, if they were the same notion. So we have distinct notions here. So they're non-identical, formal functions and biological functions, is the point. And I think this creates a gap if we understand cognitive science, computational cognitive science, as in the business of ascribing formal functions, and we understand even such things as systems neurobiology and neurophysiology as primarily in the business of ascribing biological functions, then there's a gap. Our old friend, the mind-body gap, right? Sorry. So before getting into the next part of the talk, I want to very quickly cover three possible responses to the gap and then problematize them. I don't know that any of them are successful, but I think that there are benefits and costs to each. So the first is to point out what is probably obvious to many of you, that biological functions are activities at the implementation level, not at the algorithmic or computational level. So I have this represented here, right? This is where biological functions are, and then formal functions are just above that. And the idea would then be to identify biological functions which approximate the activities identified by formal functions. And I take it that this is like the option that most cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind are tempted to. However, I think that going this route, while it means that norms of rationality can be approximated, I don't think that they reduce to biological normativity. I think, in fact, that accuracy, truth preservation, veridicality sort of slip through our fingers. And I think that because these truth preservation, truth, accuracy, veridicality are made they're made dependent in a way on pragmatic or practical norms like survival and reproduction. So truth in a way becomes relative to these wider pragmatic or practical aims. And while we can retain some degree of veridicality by stipulating that these wider pragmatic or practical norms are satisfied only if, say, perception is accurate, it does nothing to explain the rational norms on activities that seem to have no obvious connection to these pragmatic or practical norms. For instance, norms of reasoning having to do with inquiry in certain scientific domains. Learning these norms and using them does not seem to be in any way essential to survival or reproduction, either individually or at the population level. And they aren't mere conventions either. While it's unlikely that a domain would require someone to reason in only one way, you could have cognitive substitution for a variety of ways of reasoning in a scientific domain. It's likely that the permissible ways of reasoning still don't bear any obvious connections to survival or reproduction. And I think a good sort of example of someone who falls into this is Dan Bernstein, who's a sort of biasing account of intentions make practical rationality basically impossible. I just don't see how his view would allow for it. That's something we can talk about in Q&A. But the thought here is that going this option means that we can approximate these rational norms, but really getting at them becomes difficult or impossible. Option 2 is to allow that norms of rationality are grounded in some biological process. For instance, social selection. So here, I'm drawing from Ruth Millikan. So her notions of derived proper functions, reproductive families, and normal conditions are designed to be inclusive of things like social selection and the use of certain design signs and the like. And this is part of the point of teleosemantics, is to sort of ground these norms in some biological process. So one might think that Millikan, all the way back in the 1980s, provided us with materials needed to bridge the gap between biological normativity and rational normativity already. And her work and others have sort of expanded on this. So I think a cost of going this way is that norms of rationality become historical and subject to change. And I don't know that this is a huge cost. I'm not sure that it is a huge cost. It might be one worth making, but I think it's worth noting that it makes mental kinds more fluid than to my knowledge, I've seen acknowledged in philosophy of mind. So when providing account of, for instance, perception, memory, inference, imagination, and so on, philosophers and cognitive scientists tend to treat the targets of their analyses as stable faculties. If we go this route, we'd have to say that what, for instance, memory is today might not be what it is tomorrow, if, for instance, certain of its features are socially selected for something other than sharing past experiences. If social selection pressures change such that this sort of sharing ceased to exist, and instead past experiences were primarily used to inform future action, where doing so need not depend on their accuracy, then memory might come to be a faculty for integrating past agency with future agency and be fully non-epistemic. But I think even if we went this route and said such things, talking to someone like Felipe de Brigard and telling him that his integrative approach to memory is what we should be thinking memory is in the sense of making memory that, he would say, no, that's not what I'm doing in giving this account. I'm telling you what memory is, not what I think it should become. So maybe thinking of what we're doing as elucidating already extant and stable mental faculties is a background methodological assumption that's fundamentally mistaken. That's fine. If so, then I think we should inform the other philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists that this is the way we're going. So this is a way in which I think the cost is there, but I don't know if it's like devastating or anything. It might just mean a change in how we do philosophy of mind. The third option, and I'll be honest that this is my preferred option, and it's a little bit flat-footed, is that we expand biological normativity to include rational normativity. So in this case, we take the aims of rationality to be part of our nature. So I think it's part of specifically human flourishing that we get the world right, and to engage in epistemic pursuits. The cost, as might be obvious to many of you in this room as well, is that it dashes the hopes of some reductive naturalists about the mind. I don't think it dashes the hopes of all naturalists nor all reductivists. If the production of true representations or truth-preserving representational processes can be made part of an account of flourishing for creatures that engage in specifically epistemic pursuits, then there's no obstacle to considering such pursuits and such activities as perfectly natural, even if it's just second nature. If we can ground these pursuits in the corresponding activities and embodied practices and developmental processes, and in turn ground these practices and processes in the right interpersonal and intellectual needs, then we need not be left with a residue of ghostly mentation that exists separately from the more germane biological realities that we recognize. That said, I suspect that fully realizing this project will require divorcing ourselves from the computational theory of mind as it currently exists. And that's sort of why I'm trying to target the background metaphysics here. But again, I don't take myself to have convinced you that option 3 is the way to go. So in the final part of this talk, I'm going to list a few examples of different kinds of phenomena that I think widen the gap between biological normativity and rational normativity. This is meant to show that bridging the gap isn't so easy. I don't think that it shows that it's not possible for any one of the three to do so. However, before I get to the ones that problematize the gap and possibly widen it, I do want to give an example where there's at least some overlap between the biological and the rational, or at least there seems to be, in terms of the biological underwriting the rational. So some instances of cognitive dysfunction or dysfunction at the level of formal functions are due to upstream biological dysfunction. So these cognitive dysfunctions would be rectified by reinstating items with a physical structure and dispositions that allow them to perform their biological functions. And I think if we thought that all cognitive dysfunctions were of this type, it would speak very strongly in favor of option 1. So an example would be, I'm focusing here on this bottom green box. So it's a feature of Parkinson's disease that there is some biological dysfunction in superior colliculus, which disrupts their blind sight. Basically, when you're walking around, you get visual information that you don't have conscious access to that tells you about the spatial environment so that you don't bump into things, right? This is one of many redundant mechanisms that keeps you from bumping into things. And this is dysfunctional in Parkinson's disease. So you could help, you could rectify the cognitive function of sort of these spatial representations by addressing the underlying neurophysiological dysfunction through, say, dopaminergic treatment, right? Rectifying the sort of blind sight disruption in Parkinson's disease. So that's one example. So now so there's some overlap, right? I'm thinking there's some overlap in terms of that kind of case. The rest of the cases are categories that you might find problematic or unrealistic or something, but I'm hoping that most people in the room find them intuitive and convincing, because then it makes sort of bridging the gap really troublesome, and I like to leave people feeling uncomfortable. So some instances of cognitive dysfunction aren't due to biological dysfunction. Some cognitive dysfunctions are failures to produce true representations or to preserve truth across transitions between representations. I'm stipulating here that the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and organism environment nexus are within normal limits in these kinds of cases. And I think that their existence or pervasiveness would speak in favor of options 2 or 3. So I take it that in these cases, something is, quote, going wrong, in the sense that Griffiths and Mathewson talk about something going wrong. There's a mismatch, there's an alien or hostile or unlucky environment. And calling it dysfunction, I don't mean to be suggesting that there's something going wrong with a proximal function. I'm just suggesting that there is something going wrong somewhere. And that this is not due to a biological dysfunction. So the example I have here is delusions of grandeur. So this is a drawing of Don Quixote tilting at windmills. So we can maintain that Don Quixote is systematically getting the world wrong without attributing any biological dysfunctions to him. Moreover, the systematicity points to there being something that's going wrong in his relations to the environment or with the environment itself. Or it might be that what's going wrong is something in him, say his ability to connect what he wishes for the world with his ability to effectively change the world to be more like what he wishes it to be. If this is right, if the latter is right, and it is something wrong with him, then the abilities at issue are agent level and have not, to my knowledge, been reduced to brain dysfunctions. I think the sorts of models that were talked about in the previous talk are cognitive models. They're models at the sort of algorithmic and computational levels. They're not properly the subjects of systems neurobiology, at least not yet. I don't think that they're going to be found in his skull, honestly. They're going to be expressions of his character. So he's disposed to flights of fancy in part because the world that he lives in cannot be made the way he wants it, and in part because he's gorged himself on a diet of fantastical narrative about chivalry and imagery that comes to compose large parts of how he wants the world to be and how he sort of forcibly engages with the world. And you'll notice these are very unscientific sounding explanations, and I mean to do that. Okay. So now on to the two sort of, okay, I'll try to be quick. So the last two. So some instances of what are labeled mental illnesses are really ways of dealing with a hostile world. These coping strategies are complex dispositions formed as part of development. So I'm here diverging with Justin and a few others in thinking that Manus's strategy picks out coping strategies that aren't selected for phylogenetically or by evolutionary processes. That said, I think a sufficiently worked out Millikinian account of Manus's strategy seems to be possible and likely to account for developmental production of these coping strategies. And if Justin's generalized selected effects account can be made to incorporate such development as a function of differential retention, then I suspect we might be in agreement as long as it's made clear that these coping strategies are developmental. So I think before formation, the satisfaction of one formal function initiates the performance of another, but the performance of the latter is impeded by some robust but contingent circumstances whose robustness leads the subject to adopt some coping strategy. And I think that the prevalence of these kinds of madness as strategy coping mechanisms would speak most in favor of option 3, but could speak in favor of option 2. So an example, PTSD and depression. Unlike Don Quixote, depressed people like the children in Gaza are not disposed to cope with by mixing reality with fantasy. Unlike cognitive dysfunction, Manus's strategy doesn't imply a failure of cognition to latch onto the world as it is. I think James, for instance, is totally right that depression, this low mood system, is reacting fairly well to the horrible shit that's going on and producing depression as a sort of normal response. However, like Don Quixote, their dispositions to anxious behavior, loss of motivation, loss of affect, lethargy, and the like are coping strategies formed by an inability to rectify things in light of recognition of injustice and frankly fucked up shit in the world and in their lives. Okay. I'm almost done, I promise. I'm in the last one. Okay. So finally, some instances of what are labeled mental illnesses are really distinct modes of satisfying norms of rationality. Alison Springle and I have written a paper that traumatic memory is one such instance, which you can find. These modes of manifesting cognitive competences are also formed as part of development, And these modes are medicalized or discouraged as part of maintaining the hostile environment that in other cases leads to madness as strategy. And again, the prevalence of these would speak most in favor of options 2 and 3. I think basically the neurodiversity movement is aiming at the right sort of thing here. So I don't think we can simply map what all counts as neurodiversity onto this final category. Some of what's now called neurodiversity will fall into madness as strategy. Some won't be cleanly mapped onto madness as strategy or cognitive style. Some of it might fall into cognitive dysfunction, as I'm using that term, or even biological dysfunction come cognitive dysfunction. But the hope of the neurodiversity movement can be realized by doing justice to these categories. And that includes fixing the world and the fucked up shit in it, that those who exhibit cognitive dysfunction, madness as strategy, or different cognitive styles have to deal with, so that they don't have to engage in the relevant coping mechanisms, and such that those who exhibit specifically distinct cognitive styles can freely express themselves without being medicalized or otherwise punished. So I'll leave this summary up and just end there. Thank you.
I like this. Can I go back to option 1? Because I felt you dismissed it a bit too quickly, as you'd expect. So if I got it right, you were granting that when it came to the visual system, edge detection, perception of physical objects, there the truth norms and the biological norms would line up okay, but you felt that there was plenty of other arenas where there were truth norms, nothing to do with biology and success and survival. I wasn't so convinced. I mean, I think about a lot of animals, rodents, primates. They put them in a new environment. They're going to run around looking at figuring. They're getting information. They're forming representations, not for any immediate practical purpose, but just storing them up against the day when they might come in useful. And maybe that's what we do. We form all kinds of representations against the day, which we might be able to make a lot of inferences, which will eventually result in actions that we hope will be successful. So it's not obvious to me that you had a good case for truth norms that didn't line up with biological norms.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So I am gonna say a lot of weird things now. So I think that non-human animals do engage in these sorts of epistemic pursuits, and that those epistemic pursuits are tied to survival and reproduction in a way that I think our epistemic pursuits, at least some of them, might not be. So I think that our perceptual systems and sort of, engaging in the kinds of everyday inferences and intention formation and imagining and memory and the like that we sort of go about our day-to-day with, we could think of them as somehow bottoming out in biological normativity. The sort of thing that I think makes option 3 more attractive is that it's saying that the sort of biological normativity at issue is like survival and reproduction, I think leaves out like the norms involved in like scientific inquiry and the sorts of reasoning, good reasoning that's involved in doing good science, right? Which is an extension of our epistemic capacities that we have in our day-to-day. And my sense is that making sense of those activities as continuations of or extensions of these other epistemic capacities requires allowing that they are part of our nature in a sort of robust way that I think if you just focus on survival and reproduction, I'm not sure you can sort of get that continuity.
We can talk more. Justin was next.
Thank you. There's so much here to think about and talk about, so I really appreciate it. I guess the only thing I wanted to say now is I want to acknowledge that there could be cognitive dysfunction without biological dysfunction. That makes sense, and people do talk that way. I mean, cognitive behavioral therapists take themselves to be trying to help fix what they call dysfunctional patterns of thinking and feeling. That the only thing I worry about with the idea of cognitive dysfunction without biological dysfunction is that it seems to lapse too quickly into you're acting or thinking in a way that I don't like. In other words, I worry that we're just going to use, once we divorce cognitive functions, dysfunctions from biological dysfunctions, I worry we're going to use it loosely. And that's what I seem to see all the time with people saying, well, that's clearly a cognitive dysfunction. When they really, if they were honest, they would mean you're just acting kind of funny and weird, you know?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's totally right. I think in proposing this category, I am suggesting something very substantial about the reality of truth and it's and there being an objective reality that we're in contact with. That isn't to say that that reality is completely revealed to us, or that there's only one way of interacting with it adequately. So the thought would be that right now we should never ascribe cognitive dysfunctions because we don't have a worked out theory of reality or human nature or how these things relate to each other such that we could identify the range of appropriate ways that we connect with the world. And maybe we should never ascribe such functions for practical, pragmatic reasons. Namely, it would be fucked up to be like, you have a cognitive dysfunction, which means I think you're crazy or weird, right? So weird. Yeah, so I totally agree with you, I think, on the pragmatics. I think the category is meant to be more the sort of metaphysical little corner that I'm trying to identify.
Thank you, and thank you for the shout out as well. That was very nice. This is kind of similar to what Justin was saying, and it's an example of it's very similar to your like madness strategy examples, but without any attribution of madness. So take an example of something like normal fear, something that everyone agrees is a totally normal response. Standard cognitive science explanation is something like fear is a token with content like that thing is dangerous. And most of the time that will be non-veridical because the system is set up to work on a smoke detector principle. So it's better to have a smoke detector that goes off when there's a little bit of smoke so that it catches every fire than it is to have one that's really insensitive to smoke and then you set on fire. Just as fear, it's better to set off when anything kind of looks like a snake or a tiger, so that you miss every tiger rather than like you get eaten by tigers. So on one sense, the fear token most of the time is irrational. Most of the things that it say, or at least non-veridical, right? It's saying like, this is dangerous, and none of these things are dangerous. But there's no biological dysfunction because the system is supposed to, you know, it's selected for responding to indicators of danger according to a smoke detector principle. And this, I mean, there's no real question here as such as like, this is another thing that's similar to the madnesses strategy example, but isn't even madness. And you might want to be careful about not overstating the idea that this kind of like lack of rationality could be like dysfunction or something like that, because otherwise, you know, 9 out of 10 cases of fear are dysfunctional or something like that. But
yeah, that's an excellent point. I hadn't thought about fear responses, and I think that, yeah, any sort of system that's part of its normal proper functioning is a lot of false positives for the occasion that you get the right, you know, true positive and avoid the predator or whatever, is conducive to fitness. Definitely sort of speaks to, speaks to that being a difficult square to circle. So I guess my thought would be that I don't know that emotions are, or feelings are primarily epistemic in nature. How I square that with thinking of them as sort of the proper within the proper domain of cognitive science and philosophy of mind. I really have no idea how to square that circle. But yeah, it might turn out that there's at sort of the level, sort of where cognition enters the picture phylogenetically might be this sort of, you have a very like successful mechanism for survival and reproduction that trades on getting it right at least some of the time. I just don't think that that kind of explanation is going to extend to all of our epistemic capacities. But I do have to think a lot more about how fear fits into this picture for sure. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering whether you have a format problem, because if you have like a cardiovascular regulation, I guess you speak about that when you speak about normativity, because that's regulate the pulsing of the heart. So when you have the pulse of the heart, I think probably the iconic representation would be the closest to the representation of the pulse of the heart in the brain. But if that's the case, then it's very hard to say like truth, like what would it mean? Who would get truth into the picture? Because, and the pulse, and when you have a cybernetic version of a self-regulatory process, which is like the regulation of heartbeat, then you would have actually a lot of leeways, and it's like an equilibrium. But rationality doesn't look like going for an equilibrium. So for example, when you don't have food, then actually it will go down. Your heartbeat will slow down because then you preserve energy and such things. So it's kind of somehow whatever happened, it doesn't look like the norms of rationality which guides it. Norms of survival, all right. But it doesn't seem to be the two to overlap sufficiently.
Yeah, so I take it that the guidance, well, so I take it in the heart case that what establishes the norm are the relevant sort of biological processes involved in, say, selection or self-maintenance that give rise to the pumping, or gave rise to the pumping in the past, or which satisfy closure or whatever. For rational norms, and I think this is more like, yeah, I kind of am against the computationalist here. I don't think the norms are established or implemented or doing their guiding work inside the person. I just don't think that happens. I think it's interpersonally, we're triangulating with each other, we're identifying intersubjectively accessible portions of reality and coordinating with each other on these things. And so this communicative activity or set of activities has the capacity to, by virtue of this ability for self-correction or correcting others and coordinating with each other's on features of reality, can get you to accuracy, veridicality, and truth. Though, depending on the notion at issue, you could think of accuracy as being a better notion because it's graded as opposed to truth, if you don't want to go in for a sort of categorical notion. And so maybe our epistemic capacities are primarily about accuracy and accuracy in light of intersubjective accessibility or something like this. And I think that kind of norm guidance we see in ourselves and also other social animals. I hope that was responsive.
I think there's a question here, David. Okay.
Do you see, any connection between cognitive dysfunction and what we call qualia, the qualitative aspects of like, which cannot be actually, incorporated in these computational theories of mind, right? For an example, we can implement all those three rules of David Maas levels, right, in an artificial robot, right? Human life or human-like robot, right? But it doesn't actually have that kind of qualitative aspect, right? What we call qualia, right? Based on Daniel Dennett, right? So how can you incorporate, the connection between these cognitive dysfunction and these qualitative aspects, right? Which may be like there is no any basis in computation, right? But it can actually based on like subjective, like heterophenomenological approach, right? But there must be some kind of a dysfunction, right? Especially in these psychiatric disorders, right? There's some kind of impairments of these cognitive parameters, right? I mean, associated with that qualitative aspects, right?
Well, so I don't think there are qualia. But I do think that what is happening in the sort of cognitive dysfunction case is that you have a set of developed capacities for rational agency that are not well attuned to the world. And that we try to understand these kinds of dysfunctions phenomenologically because we don't tend to consider their historical development. So the qualitative aspects, I think, have to do with the history of the agent and the history of their development and the history of their being, you know, for lack of a better phrase, and to really show my Pittsburghian hand, right, how they are brought into the space of reasons. That history, I think, is informative of the qualitative aspects specifically. But telling a story about how that is in each individual case is going to be very difficult. And I think it's just, I suspect that it really means that if you have a case of cognitive dysfunction, you're dealing with a unique case always. You can group them in as much as they have similar trajectories and similar histories. But my guess is that it's going to be really difficult to find anything like a natural kind among them. I don't know. I hope that was responsive.
We've got time to have discussion later on, but we run out of time here now. So say thank you very much. That was great.